الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah, this is week 3 of this 5-week course, these 5 sessions that are centered around educating the heart. And the purpose of these sessions is to understand the importance and the central place that the heart has in the great teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and that, as was previously mentioned, the heart is a universal, in that virtually all real, authentic religious traditions, as well as that at the heart of really every civilization. And it is only that modern man that has diverted from this understanding, that has moved away from the center. And that when that happens, is that everything else becomes chaotic. And one of the most important passages that we took last week was the passage where that Hujjat Islam, Imam Muhammad bin Muhammad al-Ghazali, that he said is that the heart is that which, if someone does not know it, they cannot know their Lord. And the heart is that which, that as a result, that if they do not know Allah, it's even more difficult and virtually impossible for them ultimately to know anything else in reality. This does not relate to that basic level of knowledge that we share that with all human beings. That this refers to a higher experiential type of knowledge, which is the whole purpose of all of the other basic types of knowledges, all of the other outward forms of knowledge, that religious and that non-religious, that they ultimately point to the knowledge that Allah refers to in the Quran, وَعَلَّمْنَاهُ مِنْ لَدُنَّا عِلْمًا, and that we taught him knowledge from our presence. And these are known as ulum al-ladunniya, literally that experiential knowledge, divinely revealed knowledge, that mystical knowledge. The word mystical is a very important one, that we've lost its context as we've lost the context of so many words in the modern usage of English. What mystical refers to the inability of the mind, the intellect, to fully grasp it. It is something that has to be grasped with a different sense. In this sense, the sixth sense. We have 5 senses that we all know, but the heart is a sense. And that the heart, when it becomes ripe and it opens up and has an ability to understand what it's supposed to understand, and it blossoms and it blooms, is that it will sense that which the other 5 senses cannot. And that this is why these sessions were aptly titled Educating the Heart, because this is ultimately what it is all about. That when we talk about educating the heart, it is not something that comes in one session or in one moment. That there's a process, just as education itself is a process that has a beginning, middle, and an end, and ultimately that it never ends, even if someone studies the basics, and that they then have the tools of learning, so to speak, so that they could be lifelong learners. That when we talk about an ending, it's only an ending in the sense of getting the tools that we need to learn. And this is the same way with the heart, is that the end, and really what is meant by that, the first end of the first stage, is to learn how to educate this heart in a way that it can then, that we could take a lifelong, go through a lifelong struggle of that achieving its purity and maintaining its purity, and that ultimately that there's no end to how polished that our heart could become and how pure our heart could become, and that it just keeps getting greater and greater, and it becomes more and more expansive in the way it becomes more and more expansive ultimately, which is ironic and even in a sense paradoxical, that it only comes to know what is actually already in it. And this is why, at a very deep philosophical level, not to scare everyone, because it does get deep when we think about this, is that we actually have a very nice solution to the subject-object dichotomy that has plagued Western intellectual history for centuries. And that, although it's found in mysticism, it's not found at the level of the mind that it's found in recognizing is that what happens ultimately at the higher degrees of realization is that what becomes subjectively experienced is the objective reality of the world. And so, in other words, is that as that Imam Ali bin Abi Talib, Karramallahu wajhuhu, who, keep in mind, is the Bab Banilat al-Ilm, he's the gate to the citadel of knowledge, who is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that he says that atahsibu annaka jarmun saghiran wa fik inta al-alam al-akbar, that you think that you're just some that minuscule, meaningless, that atom or body, literally. That he says, but in reality is that the greater world is folded up in you. And what ends up happening is that at the level of the intellect, that we have the subjective reality of the human being, which is the way that we interpret or process the quote-unquote objective world that is out there. And in other words, is that if I'm looking at this table that is before me, I know this is a table of a certain height, of a certain color, of a certain shape, but I only know that by the way that that table is being filtered in through my senses. Okay, that let's say that I just was colorblind, and I'm saying, no, that table is yellow. You're like, that table is not yellow, that table is like a shade of brown. And then the person next to you says, no, the table's blue. And how do we know objectively who is right? That is there an ultimate objective reality to that table, or is there not? And how do we ever know? Because the only way we know is that it's filtering in through that our sense of sight, or if we feel it, or if we hear a noise, if someone knocks on it, or something like that. We filter everything that we know about the world through our senses, and we know our senses to be limited and fallible. And so how can we be guaranteed, philosophically speaking, is that what I'm witnessing is the same as what you're witnessing? And that this is the quagmire of this philosophical problem is still with us to this very day. And that's a whole topic in and of itself. But it's interesting that our ulama and those that have developed the inner state of their hearts had actually solved this problem centuries ago. And it was never really a problem for us. As is the case in so many of these issues that we get dragged into as Muslims of the modern world, that if we would just learn our own deen and our own tradition in its vastest understanding, is that we wouldn't allow ourselves to be dragged into a debate that is framed and actually not a part of our intellectual history, and we could offer a very nuanced understanding that perhaps could help other people get out of that same quagmire. And that what happens is that the objective world ultimately becomes that a reality within one as we subjectively view that. And that how that happens, this might not be what we learned in Sunday school, or that we might have been taught that to speak of something in this nature is bid'ah or an innovation, and that our deen doesn't have anything to do with this. Well, it couldn't be further from the truth. And that we could go into great detail about proofs of the existence of this type of knowledge from the earliest periods. And that the nature of the Prophet was, as in being a prophet, is that he spoke in a way, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that everyone that could take from that according to their various degrees. And that we tend to forget that Sayyidina Abu Hurairah that said that I memorized from the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam 2 types of knowledge. One of them that I told other people about. The other, that were I to have spoken about it, that they would have cut my throat off. In other words, is they thought I would have they would have claimed that I'm a heretic. And that there is numerous statements from the early period of people that when you are, and the difficulty is because these knowledges are known through the heart. They're not known through the mind. They're not known through the intellect. And so when you put them in language by itself is a product, right, of the mind. Without the aql, that there is no language. And that this is why the same word that we have for speaking is a similar word that we use for the rational faculty of the human being. And that were it not to be for language, we wouldn't be able to think. is that language, in a sense, is that window that allows us to see out in the world. And that this is why language is so amazing. And this is why that it's so important to understand the concept of a sacred language. And that there are many sacred languages in the world, and every language, in a sense, insofar as it is from God, it is sacred. But there's various degrees of perfection in the various languages. But unquestionably, the most perfect language is the Arabic language, because this is the language that Allah endowed His most beloved Prophet with, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In other words, is that the Arabic language itself, that there is deep metaphysical realities that are embedded in it. And this is why learning it is a part of learning your deen, even at a basic level. And that the impact of the language itself, right, on the heart is great. And just, this is a story that we might not understand, but just to show, and I think that it's important. Some people criticize me for mentioning stories like this, but I tend to think that in reality that they're important. And that the reason is because that based upon the principle I believe that we stated earlier, is I don't believe as a Muslim community that we can deal with the increasingly difficult intellectual challenges unless that we're rooted spiritually, have deep spiritual roots. Because I believe, as we will see in the topic of today's talk, that's supposed to be about the heart and human behavior, that we will see that there is an intimate relationship between that our behavior, the way we think, and the purity of our heart. In other words, that if we're not rooted spiritually, there is we're susceptible to a number of things that, not the least, that err in terms of our thought. And we don't obviously oftentimes associate error of thought with our spiritual state, but indeed that they are that intricately related to one another. And so that an example of this is that one of the righteous folk, that he went into a very powerful spiritual state, and he was unconscious for a period of time. And for us to understand that that's possible, that the likes of Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab, the second caliph, he was known to have read certain verses of the Quran, and at times that would pass out for about 24 hours. And literally he would be unconscious, and he'd wake up, and he'd been unconscious for about 24 hours because of the depth of his reflection upon the verse of the Quran. And he wasn't the only one. There was multiple examples of the early folk that this used to happen to them. And what was it about that verse that induced this state on him? And this is not some fake thing, because people could Google this type of stuff and see people going through trances on YouTube and all kinds of crazy stuff. And this is not some goofy Sufi, that really weird cultic type stuff. This is very real. That spiritual states are real, and that's its own story to prove that this actually happens. What I mentioned suffices about Sayyidina Umar Khattab. So this individual was going through a very powerful spiritual state, and that during the spiritual state he was unaware of himself, but he was reciting the alphabet, alif, ba, ta, tha, jim, ha, to the end of the 28th letter, and he would repeat it again. And his student, who was present with him, asked him that after he regained consciousness, that why were you reciting the alphabet while that you were sleeping? And that he went on to say, he said, every time that I recited that a letter, that a new world was opened up to me. So we mentioned last week that Wahab ibn Munabbih said, is that commenting on the book, the second verse of the Quran, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, is that Allah Ta'ala created 17,000 worlds. I believe we quoted that the dunya and the akhirah being two of them. Okay, what are the other 16,998? And that this dimension, and that this is the whole point, is that when we look at the vastness of the phenomenal world, anything that we can see through any of our five senses, or with a tool like a microscope or a telescope, or that come to know exists through a mathematical equation, that all of that is just like nothing compared to what exists in the first heaven or the second heaven or the third heaven. That Allah Ta'ala that has created that things that we will never ever know, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that the whole point of us knowing the vastness of this world, and that to me, actually, that if the world did take 14 billion years to create, that's even more amazing than if it would have taken only 2 seconds. Because Allah Ta'ala could have just created everything, and it only been around for 100 years, and everything is ready. But the fact that that if it really was the case, that took that long, and that we have that these 4 forces, the strong and the weak, electromagnetic force, gravity, and so forth, these 4 major forces that are a part of this world, that are really sunnah of Allah Ta'ala, and that they developed in this way, and then Allah Ta'ala was preparing that for the crown of creation, which is the human being. That's even more amazing, because imagine 16 or 14 billion years, la ilaha illallah. That is mind-blowing about that, and anyhow, that this all relates to language and the importance of language, but all of that is still within the realm of the rational, that there is a language that transcends the language of the tongue, and this is the language of the heart. And this is why one of the poets said, he said that نظر الحبيب المحب إلى الحبيب سلام والصمت بين العارفين كلام. He says that the gaze of a lover towards his beloved is salam. All you have to do is gaze, and there's something that you're saying with mute eloquence that you're not even expressing with your tongue. And he says that silence amongst the Gnostics, people who know God, that it is in reality kalam. It's as if they're speaking. In other words, is that there is a different speech that is happening here. But that learning how to control this tongue and to use it for Allah Ta'ala's sake is the first step to open up the speech of the heart. And then you reach a degree where that you even have to learn how to be silent at the heart level. And learning how to master the speech of the heart is harder than mastering the speech of the tongue. Because the speech of the tongue, of all the 7 limbs, the tongue is the hardest to master. But if we can master the tongue, then that there's no speech of the heart that is developed. And then if we can master the speech of the heart, that then with that silence is that we can have the higher degrees of understanding. And this all pertains to the spiritual path. How to tie all of that into the heart and human behavior. This to me is the heart of these lessons. It's right in the middle. And if the only thing that we're going to talk about would be this, it would suffice. And that especially given the goals that we are trying to achieve, if we look at the beautiful write-up, that it is that the heart is the place of contentment and inner peace. As such, in these times of discord and disharmony in the world, it is essential to engage in the education of the heart as much as the mind to change and improve our collective condition. That the goal of this is to learn how to attain a virtuous and peaceful heart. So we'll talk about virtues next week, but a peaceful heart is really what this is all about. And that until that we understand the expansive nature of the heart and the purpose of the heart, the importance of the heart, and how we should view the heart, and to put it in its proper place, is that we will never achieve this peacefulness. And as long as that we don't understand how the heart relates to human behavior, it is impossible to be peaceful. And that this crazy individual who did what he did to our dear brothers and sisters in North Carolina, is that this shows what happens when people neglect the heart. That if you don't understand that the various thoughts that come to your heart, and you don't understand the various inclinations that you have as a result, and you don't have the proper knowledge to give yourself proper judgment or to restrain yourself, that it will lead to belligerent, animalistic, barbaric, and savage behavior, as we've seen. May Allah Ta'ala have mercy on the soul of Diya, Yusuf, Razan, and make everything easy for their families. This is a tragedy, and that we hope that Allah Ta'ala will accept their martyrdom in His presence, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that through attempting to, despite the savage nature of this crime, that we understand a wisdom in it that inshallah will be an inspiring incident for generations and generations to come, but outwardly that we should that recognize that this is a tragedy, and that notice the wisdom, but recognize outwardly it's a tragedy. That this is an example of what happens, how this whole thing is that is completely upset if we neglect this. So the heart and human behavior, how does this all work? That we don't do anything outwardly without the heart. All behavior, every action, every deed, everything that we do outwardly, that stems from the heart and is rooted in the heart. It is inconceivable to do anything that outwardly, unless that it is initiated from the heart. And that all actions that we do, all behavior, that ultimately begins here at the heart level. And that there is essentially 4 different stages to action. And I'll just mention those briefly, and that will be the topic of discussion today. Understanding each and how they relate to human behavior. That there is what are called khawatir, which are simply thoughts. You could do fancy, translations such as that suggestions or involuntary suggestions or something of this nature. But it really gets back to thoughts. Is that the second is, after the thought is the mail, is your inclination towards that thought. Do you incline towards it? To what degree do you incline towards it? Do you not incline towards it? To what degree do you not incline towards it? The third degree, or the third stage, is the hukm al-qalb. In other words, that the judgment that you make in relation to that inclination that results from the initial thought that comes to your heart. And then finally is that what you decide to do with it. Do you act upon it or not? Which relates to your intention. And we only do things outwardly, in a voluntary sense, that when we go through this process. Now, the way I just described it took about a minute and a half to say, even though it's only 4 different stages. But we're doing this constantly. And that some have said that there is up to 70,000 thoughts that come to our mind every day. And Allah Ta'ala knows best that whether there's really 70,000 more or less, that we are constantly making decisions. That from how to tie our shoes, to which way that we're going to walk down the street, to what we're going to wear in the morning, to whether we're going to do this or whether we're going to do that, what we're going to eat. We are constantly making decisions, and sometimes that instantaneously. Is something happens that we do something instantaneously, and so this process is not always that long and drawn out. Major decisions in our life that we might take a long time, but we move from instantaneous decisions to that long drawn out decisions, and that we oftentimes just have reactions as well, and that we have to understand how that fits into the instantaneous decisions and so forth. And so that the first thing that we have to understand is these things called khawatir, these thoughts or these suggestions that come to your heart, to our hearts, and that it is impossible to have a tranquil heart without understanding this, because that precisely the reason why so many people are disturbed outwardly is because of the state of their hearts. And that there are people on the face of this earth who, that of these, let's estimate 70,000 thoughts that come to the heart every day, is that every single thought that comes to their heart is accompanied with peace and mercy and harmony. And they're of an angelic source. Even if sometimes that they're majestic responses, right? Such as that if you see someone that being trampled or harmed or beat up, and you step in to defend that person, even though you might have to hurt that person, that still, that the source of that thought is angelic because you're standing for justice. So it does include, when I talk about peaceful and harmony, it doesn't mean that necessarily that there's not some type of that rough response outwardly. And that if it's justified accordingly, that it would still have these same traits. And that the proof of that would be is if we look at the example of Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib, which we've probably heard the story many times, is that he's in a battle defending Islam from that disbelief, and that while he's wrestling with someone, that his opponent spits in his face, and he's just about to give him the death blow, and at this point he stops. And some people were witnessing this and wondering that why did you stop when this is a fight, and that by any rules of any international law or anything else that you have the right, this is a combatant, to take the life of this person, and that he stops. Then he comments on that later. He says, at first that I was fighting him for the sake of Allah. He says, but when that he spat on my face, I refrained because I didn't want to kill him for my nafs, out of being angry for him spitting in my face. They exercise self-control to this degree. Who in a fight is going to stop and like, oh wait, before I hit this guy, I want to make sure that I'm doing this for Allah's sake. Right? In the moment where your adrenaline is running and your life is on, who can exercise self-control to that degree where they're able to check their behavior based upon a potential thought that might come to their heart in a battle? And that another proof of this is that it's mentioned and referred to in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that there are examples of Sahaba that in battle that had so much harmony that they'd actually doze off in battle. And you could imagine, how could someone doze off if you're fighting? I mean, that seems like something like no one could possibly do. But if you're that tranquil internally, that you won't respond like other people respond, that you will be doing what you need to do outwardly, but there will be a very different presence to you. And that, where's that from these crazy fist-waving, that angry folks that we see so often on the media? Where are these meanings of these true people of Allah? And so the first thing we have to understand are the thoughts, and that there's 4 basic sources of thoughts. We'll speak about 3 because one is a bit abstruse. That they either come from the nafs, which is your ego, your lower self. They come from shaitan, which is the source of evil, or they come from an angel, so that it's angelic. This is essentially the 3 sources of thoughts, and that these are also simultaneously the 3 sources of dreams. And so various dreams that some people have, that most people have dreams that fluctuate between dreams of the ego and that between dreams that are more of a demonic nature. And that people sometimes could have dreams that are of an angelic source, but there might be that one dream has all 3 components in it. And it's 10% angelic, but there's 30% of the nafs weaved up in there and 60% is demonic. Or it could be a different ratio. And that oftentimes becomes very difficult to sift through and to understand that, or it could just be a very true dream that is powerful. We wake up, it's vivid, and that has its own signs, and that dreams are reality. Ibn Sirin was from the Tabi'een, and the one who wrote the famous translation of the book that many people like to read to interpret their dreams, which is not the best of all ideas, because he sometimes would take half a day to interpret a dream because of the number of things he would ask about. But there's deep symbolism in these dreams, and that there are people that are endowed with a special type of knowledge. I believe that, and I've seen that firsthand. I've experienced that, and I've told the story. Some of you know the story, that one time when I was studying in Mauritania, I got very ill, and akramakumullah, I had diarrhea for about 8 or 9 days, and I was already very weak there. It's extremely hot. There's not a lot of food to begin with, and I couldn't eat. Every time I'd eat, a'udhu billah. It just was a bad situation. I was just losing more weight. I was totally dehydrated and just sick. And I tried a whole bunch of different things. None of it worked. So the man I became Muslim with, who was my teacher, who I was living with at that point, Sheikh Khutr Wudbayba, that he decided to take me to a man that he described as kind of an Arabian healer, right? Like one of these Arabian doctors, like something you'd see like on a movie or something. And it was so, like, he didn't have a practice, or he didn't have like a clinic or anything like that. Like, we went down to the souk, which is not much in Mauritania, or at least where I was, and we found this gentleman, and he's just standing there, and that he explains to him my condition. It was a very
austere man. Really, it's just he fit the description of what you would expect. And that it was explained to me by Shaykh Khoti that these, they have a nur, a light of knowledge in the heart where they can that they can tell what's wrong with people and prescribe things for them that they just inherit, grandfather from grandfather. And I was like, okay, I'll try anything at this point. And so this man, he just was standing there and he put his hand on my, right here, and he just sat there. He says, feed him a plate of liver. Right? Liver is actually a delicatessen in Mauritania, so the honored guest, you'd serve liver, right, or the head, which I know that we're not used to in the United States. I have actually a very funny story about that with a close friend of mine, Mustafa Davis, with that. Anyhow, so they bought me a plate of liver, cooked it, and that literally I ate the liver and gone. It completely left. Right? So I believe that there are people that have that certain abilities that other people don't have, and I think that with all there's many wonderfully great things that modern science has discovered and founded, but that if it means that we neglect all the traditional understandings, I think that's a mistake. That anyhow is that these three tendencies are what is really taking place at the heart. Is that we have different types of thoughts, and we have to know what are these thoughts and what are their signs. The sign of a thought that comes from an angel is that it's peaceful, is that it's harmonious, is that it almost has like a lightness to it, and it's always for good. It's always for good. The sign of a thought from the nafs is that it's heavy, and it thuds, and it's repetitive, and it just comes boom, 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 right? And that you think about it, you forget about it, but then you think about it again, and it becomes, the more you think about it, the more that it solidifies in your heart, right? So it could be something as silly as, right, a cheeseburger, and then you see an advertisement, it's like, oh my God, I gotta have that cheeseburger, and then you just start thinking about that cheeseburger and the juice like dripping off the side, and it's right. As soon as class is over, you dart and you buy your halal cheeseburger. It could be something, but there's something about that the more you think about it, the more that it solidifies in your heart, right? We know this with relationships. This is why it's always good to at first be wise in your relationships for the unmarried folks here, right? Why? Because that once your heart becomes attached to someone, what if it doesn't work? And it's always wise to take it step by step, and that resorting to the Hanafi school of trying to get married without a wali and all that type of stuff, I wouldn't recommend that. That unless that it be a last case scenario, and that I don't know how Imam Suhaib deals with these situations, but these are rampant on college campuses everywhere. But the more adab that you have in the process, the better. The more you involve the family and you do it in the church, the more blessing will be in the marriage. And it's good to keep a little bit of distance, because is that if you find someone that you're thinking about to be your long-term partner, and you start thinking about them, and you start talking to them and interacting with them, that it's not that we don't want, people should, there should be attraction, that there should be compatibility and all of that, but it reaches a level where, if anything would ever go wrong, then all of a sudden he drops out of Princeton because that he can't concentrate, and that he's, and these things, all kinds of things happen. That we know people that they lose their scruples when that it doesn't work, or that the father wants her to marry someone from back home, or wants her to marry someone else. There's issues that happen. The point of all this is to use that as an example, is that the more and more you let the thoughts of the nafs solidify, is that the more firmly rooted they become. And then that the tendency of the thoughts of shaitan is that they're thoughts that are always of an evil nature, or at least attempting you, if he can't get you to do outright evil, to what? that do a lesser good. And so shaitan could come to you in the form, in the guise of good. But his intention is to get you to do a lesser good, if he can't get you to do outright evil. And generally speaking, that shaitan has a number of different plots. And that what he does, it's not like the nafs where it's repetitive. He'll come from one direction, and then he'll come from another direction, and he'll come from this direction. And your heart is aptly described. The metaphor of the heart is it's like a fortress. And quite literally there's a battle taking place. There's a battle taking place. And if we don't recognize there's a battle taking place, we're going to lose. We have to see it for what it is. And this is why that when they were coming back from battle, even though it's a weak hadith, it is of true meaning, is that you have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. This is always the way it's been understood. The jihad in nafs is the greater jihad. Why? Is because you can't ever leave that battlefield. Your nafs is you. It is going to be with you until the day that you die. And it's not like shaitan that you can just once and for all just turn away from and that's it. Your nafs is with you. That, it's like riding, a beast of burden, and a donkey or a camel or something. We don't tend to do that anymore, but I've actually ridden both of those. You can't just all of a sudden walk 3 days straight, right? Your donkey or your camel is going to die, or you're going to harm them severely. You have to walk a little bit, you have to take a rest. You have to walk a little bit, you have to take a rest. You have to entice the camel and sing to it. And this is why that they used to sing to their camels. And that you might even see these videos online where people that are master camel drivers, that they can actually sing to camels, and camels will start crying, right? Because of the beautiful sounds. And that camels will start they'll start going when you sing to them. If you get the right melody and the right tune, that camels, this is what camel drivers do. This is why they call them hadis, and this is why they call that spiritual poets hadis. That's because they do the same thing to the heart, what camel drivers do to that camels, to get them to move along the way, to preoccupy them with something that's beautiful. And you can't leave it. You have to slowly progress over a long period of time. And so that the thoughts of shaitan, what shaitan will first try to get you to do is disbelieve. This is his first plan of all. If he can get you to disbelieve in any way, is that he's succeeded. This is the first thing he wants you to do. Is that if he can't get you to disbelieve, he will try to get you to be a profligate, and just to do all kinds of sin, all different types of haram. That if he can't get you to do haram, is that he will try to prevent you from doing good. If he can't prevent you from doing good, he'll try to get you to postpone doing good. If he can't get you to postpone doing good, he'll try to get you to be hasty and to do too much good. Because there's people that happens to them where they get so excited, like they do too much, and then everything falls apart. Right? There's burnout. And if he can't get you to be hasty in doing good, is that he will try to get you to do good for the sake of other people. So you're a believer, you're avoiding the haram, you're trying to do good, that you haven't fallen into his plot of postponing, you're doing it, you've overcome that part, that you're not taking on too much, you're progressing slowly and steadily, and at this point he wants you to do it for the sake of other people. This is where riyā and ostentation comes in. And then that in of itself has various degrees. Is that getting you outright to solely do it for the sake of someone else, this is what he wants you to do. If he can't get you there, that he will try to make you happy that when other people find out about something you did. So you might have done something good, and if someone else speaks about and this person did this and this and this, if we become happy about that, that's what This is why the science is honestly scary. And once you delve into the science, you're like, this should be the only type of khutbahs that people give. Because this is life and death in the religious sense, are these matters. And this is the way that our ulama have defined, if that you are happy that someone else knows about your deed, solely for the sake because they know about it, that it's riyā. there's nothing I can say or anyone else can say. It's the reality. Now, if you're happy because that you see it as a blessing of Allah Ta'ala upon you, which we got to be careful not to fool ourselves that that's our state. That's something else. And so that then there's people who that don't do it outwardly for other people, that don't if other people know about it, that they don't get happy. But let's say someone comes to find out that they're doing something, that they actually have more energy, right, in doing that very thing when they know people know about it. And so that where does that extra energy come from? It comes from the nafs. From the nafs happiness that other people know about it, so that extra motivation, where does it come from? If it's coming from that, it's a subtle type of that ostentation. And that the most subtle type of ostentation, well, of all, is that, let's say none of that's happening. That someone is worshiping Allah Ta'ala sincerely, that whether people know about what they're doing or not does not matter to them, whether people find out about what they're doing or not does not matter to them, but they subtly expect people to deal with them in a certain way because of who they are. And so that they expect that when they come into a gathering that people, right, acknowledge them, or make space for them, or treat them in a certain way, that they should be saying salams to me. Why would I send salams to them? That these are subtle signs, and that riyā is very, 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 very subtle. Like more subtle than a black ant on a black rock and the blackness of night. But all of that is still one plot of shaitan that has various levels. And if he can't get you to do that, there's something even more subtle. Is that he'll try to get you to be impressed with yourself. Urjub says no. And so that if you haven't fallen victim to that, that he'll try to get you that when you do good things, is that you think you're somehow special. And you attribute it to yourself. And there's a slight difference between urjub and kibr. Arrogance, haughtiness is when you actually think you're better than someone else. That with urjub, all you need is a mirror. And that you're just impressed with yourself. And who you are and of yourself. And that you see that your deeds as being from something that you yourself do. And the only way to ward that off is to be perpetually in a state of shukr. In a state of gratitude. But the point is that everything that was just mentioned, all of that takes a lifetime to conquer. But if we've never heard that in our lives before, and that we've always been told that this whole science is innovation, and that we can't focus on it, how on earth? This is the most important thing of all. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدَ اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. They have only been commanded that to worship Allah being sincere to Him in religion. And if we don't understand what was just mentioned, how are we going to be sincere? So take this back. We have these three different types of thoughts. And that what you'll notice is that in terms of all voluntary acts, now I'm not talking about reactions now and things like that, but I'm talking about all voluntary acts, is that it stems from one of these three sources. And that the only other fourth type that we'll just mention but not in detail is that a thought that comes directly from Allah. It is possible that someone has a thought come to their heart directly from Allah. And that could be a thought that motivates someone to good, or it could be a type of punishment for something that someone has done. And that's its own discussion. And you'll find great details to what I mentioned in a book of Imam Ghazali titled The Path of the Worshippers, translated by Mukhtar Holland, rahimahullah, who was an amazing scholar, Oxford graduate, and translated a number of books. That his focus was on books of the heart. He translated a large number of books of Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani, and he translated books of Imam Ghazali as well. And as I understand, they're editing now. He translated the entire Ihya. They're editing that now, and Allah knows best. But the point is that that's the first step, is that we have to start recognizing these thoughts, so that when all of a sudden we have a thought in our mind to do something, that we have to start catching it. That, as Ibn Sidi Abdul Wahid says, وَزِنُ الْخَاطِبِ الْقِسْطَاسِ, is that we learn to weigh our thoughts in the scales of what? Of the sacred law. And so that we, the first step towards piety and towards wilayah, sainthood, is to start to be aware of our thoughts. And that there's no way to have a virtuous and peaceful heart without being aware of your thoughts. Because that all that uncomfort all torpidity of the heart stems from these thoughts that we have. Right? There are people that never ever in their life have a thought of anxiety about sustenance. And what kind of state of heart would that be? Like to never ever have a thought about anxiety, about sustenance, about losing their home or losing their job or something of this nature. That's in order. Like this is essential. And so that if we're having them, it doesn't mean that we panic. It just means that we have to learn how to deal with them. And that once we start to understand these thoughts, is that this takes us to the second stage of human behavior. And again, all of this is happening at the heart level. So we have thoughts that come to our heart. And then when a thought comes to the heart, the next thing that happens is that we have an inclination either towards that thought or we have an aversion away from that thought. Right? And that this relates to that when we're talking about the nafs in its three stages, the nafs that incites to evil, that the reproachful soul, and then the tranquil soul, is that according to, and again, that is who we are collectively as human beings, that depending upon the state of our soul will depend upon how we naturally incline towards either thoughts of good or thoughts that are from shaitan, thoughts of evil, or thoughts that are from the nafs, depending upon the state of purity of our heart. And so that if we're in the lower degrees of purity, is that we might have a bad thought, and we naturally incline towards it. Your nafs likes that thought. And we know that it's wrong, but your nafs is inclining towards it. And the truest sign of iman is that we actually dislike what is happening there. We feel uncomfortable. Like, wait, I know I'm not supposed to like that. And that's a sign of iman, that you naturally have an aversion towards, right, that thought. So according to the degree of the purity of our soul will be to the degree which we incline towards the thoughts of good, or we, if it is a word, disincline and turn away from the thoughts of evil. Do we have to stop at 8?
8:15.
8:15. Okay. So that the second stage is the inclination that we have towards that thought. Okay? And that the beauty of this all is that Allah Ta'ala does not take us to account for the first or the second stage. We're not taking into account for the thoughts that come to our heart. That's considered to be that غير اختياري, it's involuntary. Right? That we're not taking into account for that. However, is that the more that we work on the state of our heart and the more that we put in spiritual struggle and the more that we start to take ourselves to account, moving up in the degrees of the reproachful soul, which is the second degree of the soul, is that the purer our thoughts become. But it takes struggle. And it takes that going against our lower selves when we have these thoughts. That's why if people tell us that, oh, just, accept yourself as you are. No, that's not true religion. That is not true religion. That yes, you have to understand yourself. Yes, you have to know yourself, and there's certain aspects of yourself that you have to accept. Right? But that doesn't mean that you just let yourself be as you are. You have to work against yourself. Any type of religion that people are telling you that is just make it easy and do what you want, that is not true religion. And if it means that people aren't going to like us in the modern world because that we still want to work against our lower soul, so be it. Is that true religion is difficult at this level because transformation is difficult. You cannot become physically fit without putting effort in. Is someone going to say, no, just eat what you want and don't ever exercise, but be physically fit? Right? If you, the amount, if you're training, the amount of attention you have to give your body, that all people that are seriously into sports, whether they're NFL players or basketball players, whatever, the amount of training, the amount of discipline that they have and the type of food that they have to eat and when and how they have to exercise and so forth, all for what? Their physical body. That it's inconceivable, right? That people that attain those degrees, and it's essentially about, yes, you have natural athletes, And when they practice, they turn out to be a lot better than people who don't practice, who practice a lot that are not natural athletes. But it really gets back to practice. Is that the greatest people that are the greatest at what they do is that they've practiced it. And this has actually been worked down into a science. Is that they say to master anything that you have to spend 10,000 hours doing that thing to truly master it. And that whatever that thing might be, whether it's chess or whether it's, that knowledge or whether it's the Arabic language or whatever it might be, your heart, is that, so why do we know that everything else we have to put effort into, but we just, religion, it's supposed to be easy. No, it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to, at this level, right, it's supposed to be difficult. And that you'll find people that just say this is how I am. Right? I can't do anything else. And they just lashed out and yelled at someone. This is how I am. I just got a hot temper, man. That's how my father was. As if like that's going to justify what you just did. Right? That yes, that from the mercy of Allah, the idiosyncrasies that we have, that other people might not necessarily have, but they have their own, that tend to be in general Allah's best easier to forgive because Allah is merciful. Right? And we all have certain things about us that are good. And we have to learn how to use those good things for the sake of the deen. We have other things about us that need working on. And sometimes there's a category of those things that pertain to us that are easy to learn, and we get rid of those things with proper knowledge and we move on. But we all have a category of things about ourselves as well that take a long time to fix. And sometimes 20, 30, 40 years. And these are the things that our spouses especially know best for married people. And that this is why it's such a blessing to have, a spouse, point out honestly to you that some of your traits. And we should see it as a blessing, I'm serious. And next time if you approach, a conflict at home from that perspective, is that you'll benefit. So keep coming. What else is there? What else is there? And it's one of the great ways to really uncover certain things like dormant in your heart that you don't know that you even have until you're in the situation to actually see whether you have them or not. And as the path of life goes on, is that you'll be put in certain situations and I've never seen that before. It's because you never put in that situation. It lied dormant. It was just waiting for the moment to arise. And it's actually a blessing of Allah that He put you in that situation so you can deal with it. So is that the next step is the inclination towards the first. Now obviously the goal of religion is, according to what our Prophet ﷺ said, none of you truly believe until his hawa, his desire, is in accordance with what I've brought. So the goal of religion, we always are going to have desire, but it just gets replaced with prophetic desire. In other words, desire that is in accordance with the love of our Prophet ﷺ. And this is why love is so important, because hawa is also a word for love. As Imam Busayr says, Ya la'imi fil hawa al-idri ma'diratan minni ilayka wa la ansafta lam talumi. That, oh, you who are criticizing me for this vestal love, were you truly to know my state that you wouldn't criticize me? That hawa relates to hawa, and the greatest way that accelerate this process is to love the Prophet ﷺ. This is why it's so essential. Is that love in and of itself, that one of the words of which is hawa, will transform your hawa just by virtue of the presence of that love over a long period of time, and to the degree and intensity of that love sometimes over a shorter period of time. But the goal is to have our natural inclination be towards that not only what is good, the best of all thoughts that come to your heart, which is the behavior of the prophets and messengers. Is that their actions are restricted to the worst thing that a prophet could do, is that where you have a choice of two goods, they do a lesser of two goods. And that's the goal of human behavior, is that in any given moment, you do the very best of all of the different options that you have. And this is the Quranic standard. And this is why it's such a crime in religion, is that when someone is diseased and literally disgusting, their soul is filthy, and that they're trying to justify the most heinous acts in the name of religion. Allah Ta'ala says, idfa' billati hi ahsan. Repel, in brackets, evil with that is even best, is even greater. Billati hi ahsan, the best. In other words, is that anything that happens to you, that however bad it is that you repel that evil if you have 5 different options and they're in a hierarchy, okay, this is good, but there's 4 options that are various degrees. That's the Quranic standard. Is not just the third best, the best of all. Like, we are not upholding the Quranic standard until we do that. And if you're not upholding the Quranic standard, just admit it and say, okay, what I'm doing is not Islam, and I'm working on myself. I'm sorry, but don't try to justify your lowly, vile nature with the book of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Right, which is the nature of people of bid'ah, is that everyone finds that proof for what they're on in the book of Allah. Right, unfortunate. But that if you go to the book of Allah diseased, it very well might be that your own disease will lead you astray in terms of your interpretation. So that's the goal, is that everything that we do in every single moment is the very best of all possible things that we can do. Now there's various degrees. And then you have someone that on the other end of the spectrum, as that in every single moment, the very worst of all possible things that they do. And then you have people that are somewhere in between. And that you have various degrees from those that are here until that those that have mastered that human behavior. And it sounds difficult to do all of that, but the beauty in this whole thing is all you have to do is put in the effort. Because it seems overwhelming. Oh my God, I have 70,000 thoughts, he just told me. And every single thought I have to scrutinize. Is it halal? Is it haram? Should I do it? Should I not do it? I'm going to go crazy. And you actually will if you do that. You have to slowly start moving towards that. What you will find is that when you put in the energy, Allah will assist you. Allah will assist you. And if He assists you, subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you will find easy that which other people find very difficult. The blessing again here is we're not taking into account for either one of these two. Even if you incline towards something that is disliked and displeasing to Allah, you're not taking into account for that until this third stage. And even in this third stage, there's a bit of a gray area. The third stage is where that now you have hukm al-qalb, that you have a thought that's of one of the sources mentioned. You have an inclination that's somewhere in the spectrum that I mentioned. But now is where your aql, your intellect comes in. What am I going to do with this thought? What am I going to do with this? What am I going to do with this inclination? And this is why here knowledge is so important. Because if you don't have knowledge, you won't know what to do. And that, as the proverb states, is that a enemy that is intelligent is less harmful than a friend that is ignorant. Because a friend you'll trust and they'll get you in trouble. Right? Whereas an enemy, at least if they're intelligent, will probably get you in less trouble. This isn't a proverb, it's not always true. Maybe. But the point is that knowledge is important here. If you don't have knowledge of what to do, it's impossible for you to do what's right. And that we have certain things that are clear, they're black and white. And that's fairly easy. And that's supposed to be what we get growing up in the maktab and Sunday school and that type of thing. We all know the major do's and don'ts, and Allah's given us a fitrah, a natural disposition that helps in that. We know what we should do and what we shouldn't do. But then, that to really determine what's the better of two goods or the lesser of two evils, that's where it becomes a bit more difficult. Because we might be in certain situations like, whoa, there's not an easy way out here. And that it's a test from Allah to see how we act. And that requires an in-depth knowledge of the sacred law. And the scholars, for lack of time, I won't be able to go into the details, give us a criterion that's not limited to the sacred law. There's 2 other criterion whereby which that we can weigh thoughts in the scale of the sacred law and beyond. And that it's at this stage, though, is that if we know that it's something good, is that the judgment that our intellect gives us that this is something good. If it's something that is permissible, then we have to just see that Allah Ta'ala accepts from people that if it's permissible, it's permissible. But then there's various degrees of piety after that. And the highest degree of piety was that of the companions that left 9/10 of the permissible in fear of it taking them into the haram. Now, we can't do that. We cannot do that. You'll go crazy. You cannot do that. But we have to respect that and be in awe of that. Is that someone who leaves 9/10 of what is permissible, that's formidable. We have to respect that. And this is why that generation was that generation. Right? This is why that they were the best of people. Is because is that they preferred the next world over this world to that degree. 90% of what is permissible they left. In order to create, if disbelief is here, and all the spectrum of haram is here, and the spectrum of makruh, and what is offensive here, khilaf al-awla, things that's better not to do is here, that here is all the permissible. They didn't even want to do most of the permissible, they wanted to remain here, and only do what was absolutely necessary for the permissible, right, so that it wouldn't drag them anywhere over here. I mean, how do we understand that in our everyday lives? Like I said, we respect that, and we love that, and we do our best. We do our best. But it's important to understand the theoretical nature of this and how it all works. And so that here is where knowledge is so important of the sacred law and of the other criterion, is that what is going to be the judgment of the intellect based upon that thought and the inclination. And it's here that we might start being taken into account, but it's not definitive. And the reason it's not definitive is because that people have different circumstances, and that our psychological profile is real about who we are and our backgrounds, and that it's on the borderline here. If it's one of those things that was just ingrained in us from the time that we were young, and this type of thing, and that we thought might be right, that type of thing, it's much easier and it's much closer to being involuntary than if it's one of those things that we actually know is actually not right, but still give it the wrong judgment. So here, we're on the verge of being taken into account, that the judgment that we give it. Or let's just say that it was kind of a gray area, like some things that are clear, but we had an opportunity to learn, but we neglected that opportunity. It's something that we should have known, we might be taken into account. Or if it was one of those things that's beyond a basic type of knowledge that usually only comes with experience over 10 years, but this is 2 years in, probably not going to be taken into account for that, because it's it wouldn't be expected of us to know that. So it varies here, but the point is we're on the verge of being taken into account. But at the next step, where it turns into intention, is where we're taken into account. Is that if it turns into an intention, and there's numerous Arabic words that are used here, is that this is where that sincerity comes in, or the lack of. And that sincerity relates to the various deeds in certain ways. In terms of the haram, that haram cannot be made halal by intention. We don't believe in concept of Robin Hood. That it can, though, relate to the permissible by making an act of devotion. And it relates to that acts of goodness by having the correct intention. And then understanding sincerity in and of itself, how to choose that choice intention to various degrees when we have these other possibilities that are there. This is all a part of this whole story. But it's here where it turns into intention now that we're taking into account. And in closing, because my time's up, that if even after we intend to do something that is wrong, that we have remorse after that and we don't do it, it actually turns into a good deed from the blessing of Allah. Even though at first we were taken into account for it. Whereas if we would have died or something came between us and that thing, we wish we could have done it but we couldn't, that we would still be taken into account for it once it reaches the level of intention. Or that if we left it for other than a reason it pertains to for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it seems that we would be taken into account for it. But the reason that we're not taken into account, that even if we did intend to do it, is that the struggle that we have to put in to then change our intention to have remorse is greater than the struggle that we put in to just succumb to that intention to do that wrong. And thus, it's transformed from a bad deed into a good deed. From the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why we see all these manifestations in the dunya of the akhirah, of the hadith Qudsi, that my mercy has outstripped my wrath. And so this is just a brief overview of the heart and human behavior, and is to, paint some broad strokes and a basic map of how this all works. And what remains is that we fill in the gaps. And that, again, it takes a lifetime to fill in the gaps. But what comes clear to me then in light of all this is that how important is this science? This science is that after we have basic belief, and after we have the basics of what we need for outward practice, this is the most important science of all. Right? This is the science that's literally a matter of our life and death in the religious sense. And that I wish that we had more khutbahs about this science. I wish that we had communities that were addressing these issues. And that if we would, that we would find is that if you have a person's heart who's right, that you will find that one person will be able to affect large numbers of people. But if our heart is not right, and we're doing all this stuff outwardly, it's a problem. One, we'll be getting ourselves into trouble, and two, it won't be as potent and it won't be as influential. Our heart has to be right with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it doesn't negate the whole idea of influence and why some people influence more than others, and that it doesn't mean that someone could have a great heart, but it's not written for him to influence a lot of folks. That is true. But in general, is that the principle does remain, is that the greater the state of purity of our heart is, the greater that we will have a positive impact, upon this world. And that if we correct our own behavior, that there are the metaphysical realities to our own that correct behavior. And I'll end on this. I know I just said I'll end, but and we tend to forget this as a community, is that the greatest thing that we can do for the rest of the world, and all of the problems in the world, is to be upright in your own self and to affect people in your circle of concern. That's the greatest thing that not only us in the United States of America, because we're resource privileged, but anywhere in the world. The greatest thing that anyone can do for their own self, family, local, regional condition, and for the ummah, is to rectify themselves, to rectify those that are within the circle of their concern, and then through their circle of influence, and then in terms of their circle of concern, that annihilate their concern into the concern of the Prophet ﷺ. And it might be that someone in the middle of the desert is that there's people all throughout the world that are in the blessing of that person because of the state of that individual's heart. And it might be that tribulations are being lifted upon people in Gaza as a result of that particular individual. And so that if we don't understand this, that we are limiting ourselves in terms of what we can do. And so that we have to focus on what we can do. And to the extent possible, it doesn't negate outward behavior. That's not what I'm saying whatsoever. But that there's only so much that we can do outwardly. And this is why our Prophet said, Niyat al-mu'min khayrun min amali. In one riwayah, ablagh min amali. The intention of a believer is better than his action. In another narration, it's a weak hadith, but the meaning is true, is ablagh. It's of further reach than their action. Right? And so may Allah Ta'ala bless us, give us tawfiq, give us harmonious hearts, inshallah Ta'ala, and bless us with these sessions. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
You have some time for questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to actually ask you about the reproachful soul and moving through the reproachful soul. So I sense a tension actually between this whole idea of like getting from reproachful soul to tranquil soul, and the juxtaposition with the background of this life being a simple struggle, and like even when you're describing this, how, for example, leaving sort of things of this world because they prefer another world. So my real question is pertaining to what you said, which is like don't accept yourself, always try to push yourself to become better, constantly challenge yourself to move through these states. But my real question is like, is this actually attainable? Does the tranquil soul actually mean that you get peace on this earth? Or is this just not, it's just not going to happen?
So, I mean, that there's no utopia on earth, unquestionably, right? But theoretically speaking, that if everyone had a tranquil soul, is that there would only be peace on earth. Theoretically, but we know that this is dunya, that's not going to happen from the standpoint of reality, but it doesn't mean that we not take into account for what we do. And that whether or not we achieve a tranquil soul or not is not as important as putting in effort to do so. Right? And then the highest degree of sincerity in that is to put in the effort to do so because it's what our Lord wants us to do subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you die trying. And that this idea of not being content with yourself, even all these self-help books, you can get books like From Good to Great and these type of folks that talk about even in a business sense, is that the secret of success is never giving up. There's a really interesting documentary we watched that one time at the retreat. That Jiro Dreams of Sushi. Has anyone seen that? You should all watch that. It's a really good documentary. It's called Jiro Dreams of Sushi, and he's like one of the Michelin 3-star chefs that is one of the best sushi makers in the world, and it's all about his story about why his sushi is so good, and it's like really expensive. They don't have any appetizers or anything like that, and people book like a month or two in advance and all this type of stuff. And the whole story is about, to me, what I'm reading, I'm just like, it's ihsan. It's just ihsan. Wisdom is Allah property of the believer. And it's amazing though what goes into sushi and what makes his sushi different than, let's say, you get some at Wegmans or whatever else, and it's just okay, but his sushi's different. And one of the things he says in there is that in all of these years of making sushi, he's constantly thinking how he can make it better. He never stops thinking. He wakes up thinking about sushi. And someone might say, like, dude, like, it's just sushi. It's not really that big a deal, right? And it's not. But the point is that this is someone, and he's actually from a Buddhist background, and it's a part of, I forget the word now that they describe. He's a part of I forget the name now. That they actually, part of their path is in mastering a craft, and that there's something to be said for mastering a craft, though, in mastering something that's formidable and noble, and that is right. In Allah katab al-ihsan ala kulli shay. Allah has written that perfection upon everything, excellence upon anything. That indeed that Allah loves it if you do something in yutqina, to do it with perfection, and so that if we're going to do something, that whether we are a mother, or whether we work at a consulting firm, or whether we are a doctor, or whether we are, civil, engineer, whatever it is that perfect what you do for Allah, and do what you do the best of the best that you can possibly do in that field, and that's our deen, and that we shouldn't think of it. Oh, this is dunya, right? Yeah, except to the degree where you recognize is that the whole reason you're doing this is for Allah. It's not for the dunya. That's where this is dunya comes in terms of that the worldly benefit that comes to you from it and the praise you might get and so forth. At that time, yes, but in terms of don't use that to justify not perfecting your craft. We should be the very best at everything that we do, ideally. And it's an amazing documentary. Yeah. And then all of the factors that go into his sushi, it's amazing. That when he would go to the local fish market, that he wouldn't just buy his fish from anyone. He would only buy his fish from the best the best of people in their individual specialty of tuna. And then he'd get shrimp from someone else, and he would get this from someone else. And then they'd go like into a side story of the person who buys tuna, and like that he was special, because that he would go in and look at all the tunas, and that they'd bid. And if he didn't get his number one choice of all of the tunas there, he wouldn't buy another tuna. He'd go home without tuna that day. And so it's just amazing. And all of these factors, all of the experience, all the time, lead to he has the best sushi. Yeah.
Question is the peace part of it.
Can it be attained?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can be attained. And even though that the higher degrees of really being in a fully tranquil soul, that's hard to attain. It's not easy to attain. But that in the process is that it can be, a relative degree of it can be attained. Absolutely. Enough to make that you serene in the majority of your states. Now that's possible. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's totally possible. And theoretically it's possible for every human being. But you have to be willing to struggle. You have to be willing to put in that time, like you would when you exercise and you're sore, like you would if you're pre-med and you have to just memorize all these different body parts and stuff like that, right? That it becomes easy when you're actually in giving surgery if you've done all the studying, but it wasn't easy memorizing all that. The same thing here. The initial stages are not easy, but then you reap the fruits of them for a lifetime.
What comes to mind when you're saying this in terms of the excellence is the time that it was introduced to us with the Sahabas, when they were told, they understand that Allah would even judge their thoughts.
No, okay.
And they said, "Rasulullah, our thoughts."
Mm.
Right. Could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah,
On that
so
connection?
that when we talked about the thoughts being involuntary, meaning we're not taking into account for them, that there's a verse that was revealed in the Quran, "In tubdu ma fi anfusikum wa tukhfuhu yuhasibkum bihi Allah." That that if you manifest what's in your heart or you hide it, what is in your own selves, that Allah Ta'ala will take you to account for it. And so the Sahaba came and were worried. He said, "Ya Rasulullah, like, we're going to be taken to account for our thoughts." And it was very difficult for him. And then the Prophet said, "Are you going to say what the children of Israel say?" He said, "Say, sami'na wa ata'na." Say that we hear and obey. And so the Sahaba said, "We hear and obey." And then that they say a year passed, and then that the verse was revealed, "La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha." Allah Ta'ala will only take that Allah will not take someone to account except for what they're able to bear. And then that this first verse is mansukh, is abrogated by this verse, and this became the standard now moving forward, which shows the greatness of the Sahaba, the resolution. You know, because if we're taking into account for our thoughts, oh my God, we're in big trouble. And that it shows that the way that we have to respond to even that which is displeasing us, but as a result of their state, that they were the means for it to become abrogated for future generations. But that's what you're asking.
I have a question. Somewhat of a practical question.
Sure.
Going back to the signs that, what's the sign that it's from Shaitan? And you went through some different things, and at the end, Shaitan would, a sign would be that you would want to do things for the sake of people, you said. Right?
Right, and then there's one more. There's actually
But
two more. The last one.
This
Yeah.
one, and I
Okay.
had a question about it. So, for the sake of people, in other words, don't do things to please people, but do things to please Allah. And
Right, and it's okay to do something nice for someone.
For
Like you
someone.
want to do something nice to your parents or to
Right.
a friend or to your spouse or something, but
right,
you
but you
don't
get the recognition.
exactly.
Right,
You
you
do
don't
it
want
for
the
Allah.
recognition.
The
So-
recognition is the key.
So, turning that,
Mhm.
you yourself are accountable for your own actions and and you might not want to do it to impress other people and get their recognition, but if you are on the receiving end and somebody is doing something, and do you not give them a compliment then? Do you not tell them and give them that recognition for doing
You
good things?
absolutely
What do you
thank
do on the receiving
no,
end?
on the receiving end you thank people.
Okay.
Right? You thank people for what they do, and that in terms of praising other people, it's a balance, right? It's a balance of praising other people. That recognition is important, so that if there was volunteers that help, thank you all the volunteers who helps, arrange this event. Giving thanks is very important. So recognition by way of giving thanks is very important, and we all know the hadith: whoever doesn't thank people is not thanked Allah. So giving thanks in that way of recognition is important. Praise has to be to its correct degree, and flattery should be avoided, which when people oftentimes, especially high-profile type people, there's a lot of flattery that takes place in very high-profile type venues, where and people, if they don't get their flatter, get very upset. And they didn't flatter me enough, and that type of thing. And they didn't mention that I'm a doctor, or they forgot that this project that I'm working on, with the president of Princeton, and obviously, my point is that that flattery is not something desirable. It's a problem, and especially if it's mudahana if it's for worldly reasons. Now, mudara is different. Tact is different, and so it doesn't negate having to speak people. Tact is actually, and we've talked about it before in the retreats, that tact is actually one of the great long lost sunnahs of our Prophet that's been abandoned. There's a really neat book called The Miracle of Tact. I believe it's called The Miracle of Tact, or something like that. You'll find it on Amazon, and it's amazing. It's very practical examples of what tact is. So tact is that speaking to people in a way that is appropriate given the situation. And so that if you're pulled over by an officer and that you say, oh, would you just come from a donut shop? Or, or something like that. Like, that's not really a good way to speak to a person in authority. Right? Now, you might not want to pull like, oh my God, my mom's going to kill me. That might be a bit much, right? But speaking to him with respect, because he's an authority figure, right? That speaking to him with respect, calling him sir, and that type of thing, that's tactful. And that people that are in positions of authority like to be respected. And if you don't respect them, there's much less chance of you getting out of that ticket than if you do. So that's not flattery, right? Unless someone starts, winging their feathers or something for whatever reason. But, also when you're going through customs, like, just be respectful. I had a situation one time that I was going to England. It's happened on multiple occasions, but one time I was going to England, and I was going there. Literally, I had all my paperwork to research like accommodations for school. I had all my papers, and this lady, she was like, "I'm not convinced that you're really coming to the UK for this." I was like, "Are you serious?" And it wasn't, I made a mistake. Like, I kind of smarted off to her. Because I was like, what? I have all the official paperwork here. It's absurd. And when I smarted off to her, that she took it personally, she just made my life miserable. And they gave me a visa, or they gave me a stamp that, I couldn't really tell the difference of it, but every time I'd go after that, they'd have to hold me for like 2 hours. They'd have to. Oh, and like some of them were nice, like, oh, I'm so sorry. But we're gonna, and they like have to, I had, in order to get my tier 4 visa for the UK to go back and forth, I had to get a new passport. Because I had this stamp, and to me I was just like, astaghfirullah. I realized that that's what I get, for stepping out of line like that. So tact is, yes sir, yes ma'am, adab, respect. And, dealing with people in an appropriate way. And really tact is that when you see a situation about to, right, is that you know how to diffuse it. Right? I'll give you an example of that. There was a situation where there was this one gentleman who was visiting me these days when I was studying in Yemen, and he for some reason wanted to be at the airport like 3 hours early. He just liked to be early. I was like, it's a small airport, you don't really have to be there early, but he just gets really nervous about flights. So alright. And there was some other girl that was not part of his family that was traveling with him. And we were supposed to pick her up. So we went to pick her up. She's nowhere to be found. She's visiting someone or something like that. So he's just completely distraught. And there's plenty of time, but he's distraught. So we just leave. He said, we're leaving her. And we just leave. I was alright. And we're going to the airport, and then they call. And they're like, oh, I'm sorry, we missed you. So we're like, alright, meet us at such and such a junction. They took a back road, and we were waiting for them at this junction. And I'm just waiting for this individual. This poor girl gets in the car, and that I'm just waiting for this gentleman to lay into her. Right? And just where are you at? So as soon as she gets in the car, that someone in the car says, oh, it's so good to see you. I'm so sorry. We should have communicated better with you. That we were, right? And just, when that person said that, the situation, right? Because what's he going to say at that point? Right? After the situation is diffused like that he wasn't able to really, show that. So tact is amazing, how learning how to speak to people. That's different than flattery. Flattery is just where you don't.
But praise, you said. Thanks,
so praise is a nice scale. You have to be careful with praise.
So if you have a child who's really studying really well.
So children
them.
are different.
Right. Okay.
Right, especially with children, it's good to praise them when they do, so they know what's good.
Right.
But praise friends to friends and that type of thing, it's a balance. And there is a tendency to get imbalanced because our Prophet that said, that throw dirt in the faces of people that praise too much. It doesn't mean literally that throw dirt in someone's face, but we've all heard, oh, you're throwing dirt in my face. And what it means is that the danger, you're putting them in a danger if you overly praise someone, because it's just that much easier for them to be impressed with themselves, right? And that if it's different clearly, if someone just thanks you for something, you feel, at your heart, so forth, there's someone's like praising you, it's that much easier to attribute what you've done to your own self as opposed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's a balance. If we're going to praise, it should be in its place. But then there's another hadith that says, إِذَا مُدِحَ الْمُؤْمِنْ نَمَا الْإِيمَانِ فِي قَلْبِهِ. If a believer is praised, the iman strengthens in their heart. And so what's that understood is that's how we're supposed to, on the receiving end, see praise. Is that if someone praises you, that your iman increases because you say, Alhamdulillah. You don't attribute it to yourself. You say, that's something Allah gave me. Even if you put effort in to earn that, well, where did that effort come from? Where did your body come from? Where did your life come from? Everything that you have in order to make that effort is ultimately from Allah. So that if someone praises you, you remind yourself that everything's from Allah and your iman will strengthen. So that's the way you kind of deal with it. And so it's just a balance of not getting into flattery, but and some people need more praise than others. There are certain people that have very low self-esteem, and there's certain people that are just just been beaten down their whole life. And what I just mentioned is kind of a general principle. When you're dealing with people like that, you have to give them more praise, and that you have to show more mercy, and you have to reach out more, and that you have to be very careful. And I think it's a danger to them if you praise them too much, right? But you have to, deal with every person, right? And that's the whole thing. Is that what's so important is that this is why we have to know the world in which we live. Is that there are people who know the principles of religion, but you put them with real people and they don't know how to implement it because they don't know. I mean, we're in the United States of America. There's dynamics in this country that are very real, and that if you don't know our people here, what I mean by our people, anyone who's in America, and their story and their history, that you could misapply a principle, and if it's unintended, you repent and you move on. Right, but there's so many different people that we are dealing with. I mean, America is an incredible melting pot. Dealing with, an Afghan refugee is not like dealing with someone who that grew up in a suburb somewhere. I learned that we were at a certain place and that it was a soup kitchen and there were certain people being fed. And it's something I caught myself on, is that this person was wearing a shirt. And I was just trying to, I'm exposing myself now, so we realize we're human beings and we're fallible, we make mistakes. That he had a Kansas Jayhawk shirt on, right? And I was like, oh, Jayhawks, huh? So I'm from Kansas. I was born in Missouri, grew up in Kansas. My father graduated from KU, and my mother did her master's at KU. And I said, are you from Kansas? But then I was like, oh, I should have said that. Because this person, I think he was homeless, and it was clear that, well, he didn't look homeless. I think someone gave him the shirt. And so what normally, if you see someone with like wearing a Jayhawk shirt, that they might have a love for the Jayhawks or it's their alma mater. That in this situation, I was like, what am I doing? I was so stupid. That person, the shirt was given to him. Right? He's in Pennsylvania. What does he know about Canada? And you just realize, that was not a smart thing to say. That puts that person, in a situation where, it's like talking about career. If you're in a situation where people are just very much into their career and that type of thing, kind of into the whole college scene, and you just meet someone and talking about career to some people, right, they're just struggling to get by, right? And like talking about career to them is going to kind of make them uncomfortable because of that. And to me, it's not easy to attain this, but at least we should be open enough to have the courage to learn that what is the proper way to talk to all people. Because that's how our Prophet was. He would have been able to perfectly relate to every single person in our society. From the crazy person who had their gender changed and has these, I always forget what they're called, those things in their ears, and then whatever, up to, someone who's from an elite aristocratic background. He would have been able to speak to everyone. And if we ever reach a point where someone is so disgusting to us that don't think that we can talk to, we're the ones who are disgusting. Right? Because that's a very serious thing. And that if anything, which is not the norm, especially in our suburban urban dichotomy in the United States of America, we should be inclining towards the downtrodden, not the opposite. And the nature of all people, Muslims included, is that they incline towards the opposite. But our Prophet was the opposite. As his inclination was towards the downtrodden. He was rooted in them, and from there, while he's also giving da'wah to everyone, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? That, and this is one of the few times where Allah rebukes him in the Quran. And it was a rebuke, though, we should always remember, of the lover of his beloved. Right? In other words, it's as if Allah is saying that, Ya Rasulullah, you are the most beloved of my creation. I only want you to do what's best. And thus he rebuked him because he was so beloved to Allah. And that when he was giving da'wah to Abasa wa Tawalla, to one of the nobles of the Quraysh, and Abdullah ibn Maktoum was more worthy of his da'wah. He was still doing something good. And where are we from that? You know, we have a lot of work to do.
Jazakallah khair, Sayyidi. Jazakallah khair to all of you for